They told me I was invisible, not just ignored, but erased, as if all I ever was didn't count. Tonight, in a noisy New York diner where neon buzzed and the scent of burnt coffee lingered, I was handed a small folded note slipped quietly beneath my plate that would change everything forever. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and at 72 years old, I've learned that love isn't supposed to hurt this much. Every morning, I wake up in my cramped Queens apartment before the sun rises, my joints aching like old floorboards in an abandoned house. The silence greets me first, not the peaceful kind, but the hollow echo of a life that used to matter. I shuffle through my daily routine like a ghost haunting her own existence. Make coffee for one, check messages that never come, stare at photos of grandchildren who've forgotten my face. 3 months ago, my daughter Sarah called me. Her voice sounded strained, distant, like she was speaking through a tunnel. "Mom, let's have dinner next week. Just us. I have something to tell you." My heart leaped like a teenager getting asked to prom. Finally, I thought. Finally, she wants to spend time with her old mother. I spent days planning what to wear, what to say. I even bought a new lipstick, Cherry Blossom, the same shade I wore to her wedding 20 years ago. But that dinner never happened. 2 hours before we were supposed to meet, my phone buzzed. A text. "Sorry, Mom. Something came up. Rain check?" No explanation. No new date offered. Just those cold, dismissive words that felt like a slap across my weathered cheek. I sat in my living room, still wearing the navy dress I'd picked out, the new lipstick feeling like war paint for a battle I'd already lost. That's when I decided to go out anyway. To that little diner on Northern Boulevard where the waitresses call you honey and don't ask too many questions. I needed to feel human again, even if it meant eating alone surrounded by strangers. The dinner rush was in full swing. Families laughing, couples sharing dessert, teenagers on their phones. Everyone living their lives while I sat in my corner booth, invisible as always. I ordered the meatloaf special. It reminded me of Sunday dinners when my children were young, when this apartment was full of chaos and laughter instead of crushing silence. The waitress was a woman about my age, with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. She refilled my coffee without me asking, smiled like she actually saw me sitting there. That's when everything changed. As she walked past my table for the 3rd time, she paused. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached under my plate and slid out a small piece of paper. Our eyes met for just a second, hers filled with urgency, mine with confusion. "Leave now," she whispered so quietly I almost missed it. "Don't ask questions." Before I could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the kitchen like smoke. My hands shook as I unfolded the note. The handwriting was shaky, but clear. "Leave now. Don't ask questions. Trust me." I stared at those words, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. What did this mean? Who was this woman? Why would she— 10 minutes later, all hell broke loose. The front door of the diner exploded inward with a crash that made everyone jump. 3 men in dark clothing rushed in, shouting something about money, about someone who owed them. Tables overturned, glass shattered. People screamed and dove under tables, the cheerful family atmosphere turning into a nightmare in seconds. I was already halfway to the back exit when the chaos erupted, following the waitress's mysterious warning. Through the window, I watched police cars arrive with sirens wailing, saw people running from the diner with terror in their eyes. If I hadn't left when I did, if I hadn't trusted that stranger's urgent plea. But that night wasn't really about the diner. It was about everything that had led me there. The years of being treated like furniture in my own family. The decades of sacrifice that nobody seemed to remember or appreciate. The slow, painful realization that the people I loved most had been using me like an old credit card. Maxed out, worn thin, but still useful for emergencies. Let me take you back to where this story really began. 45 years ago, I married Henry Sullivan in a small church in Brooklyn. I was 27, full of dreams and wearing my grandmother's pearl necklace. Henry worked construction, had calloused hands that held me gently and eyes that lit up when he laughed. We weren't rich in dollars, but we were wealthy in hope. We moved into this same Queen's apartment as newlyweds, painted the walls sunshine yellow, planned for the children we'd raise here. Sarah was born first, followed by Michael and then little Tommy. This apartment was chaos then. Toys everywhere, cartoons blaring from our old television, the smell of baby formula and Henry's aftershave mixing with whatever I was cooking for dinner. I was tired all the time, but happy. Bone-deep happy in a way I can barely remember now. Then Henry died. One Tuesday morning in November, he kissed me goodbye and walked out to work like any other day. 8 hours later, a police officer stood at my door with his hat in his hands and devastating news. Construction accident. Crane malfunction. Henry was gone at 46, and I was suddenly a widow with 3 children under 15 and no idea how to survive. The life insurance wasn't much. Social Security helped, but not enough. I took a job at the department store downtown, standing on my feet 8 hours a day selling cosmetics to women who had husbands to go home to. At night, I waitressed at a restaurant in Manhattan, serving couples on dates while my own heart stayed broken. For 20 years, I worked 2 jobs. I missed countless school plays because I was at work. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so my children could have real meals. I bought their clothes at thrift stores and told them it was because vintage was fashionable. I lied awake at night adding numbers on scraps of paper, figuring out how to stretch every dollar until it screamed. But I made it work. Somehow, I made it work. I saved every penny I could for their college educations. While other mothers my age were joining book clubs or taking trips with their husbands, I was squirreling away money like a desperate squirrel preparing for endless winter. I had no social life, no hobbies, no identity beyond being their mother. Everything I was, everything I did, revolved around giving them the future Henry and I had dreamed of. Sarah went to college upstate and studied business. Michael got his degree in engineering. Tommy became a teacher. I was so proud. So exhausted, so sure that all my sacrifice had been worth it. They were successful, educated, ready to take on the world. I was 58 when Tommy graduated. Finally, I thought, finally I can breathe. Maybe I can take that trip to Ireland my mother always talked about. Maybe I can learn to paint, or join a senior center, or just sleep in on Sundays without guilt gnawing at my stomach. But that's not what happened. Instead, my children started seeing me differently. Not as the woman who'd sacrificed everything for their futures, but as an obligation, a burden, someone whose job was to be available whenever they needed something, but who didn't deserve the same consideration in return. It started small. Sarah would call and ask me to babysit her 2 children while she and her husband went out. Of course I said yes. What grandmother wouldn't want to spend time with her grandchildren? But she never asked if I had plans. Never offered to pay me or even bring dinner for the kids. She'd drop them off with a quick, "Thanks, Mom, you're a lifesaver," and disappear for hours. Michael needed money for a business venture. "It's a sure thing, Mom. I'll pay you back with interest." I emptied my small savings account and gave him $12,000. Money I'd been saving for home repairs, for security, for some tiny measure of independence. He never paid me back. When I gently asked about it months later, he acted irritated, like I was being petty for mentioning it. Tommy just disappeared. After college, he moved to California and called maybe twice a year. Christmas and my birthday, if I was lucky. His voice always sounded distracted, like he was talking to me while doing something more important. The pattern grew worse over the years. They saw my apartment as a free hotel when they needed to save money. They saw my wallet as their emergency fund. They saw my time as their convenience, but they never saw me as a person with needs, dreams, or feelings of my own. Last Christmas, I spent 3 days cooking a traditional feast. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce made from scratch like my grandmother taught me, pies cooling on every available surface. The apartment smelled like cinnamon and memories. I set the table with my good china, the set Henry and I received as a wedding gift that I'd barely used in decades. They all came for once. Sarah brought her family. Michael came alone because his wife decided to visit her own mother. Tommy flew in from California looking tired and checking his phone every 5 minutes. I thought it would be perfect. I thought finally we'd be together again like the family we used to be. But they spent the entire dinner complaining. The turkey was too dry. The stuffing needed more salt. The kids were bored and wanted to watch television. Michael asked if I had any investment money sitting around that could help him buy a new car. Sarah mentioned that her friend's mother had moved to a retirement community and seemed much happier. Not one of them thanked me. Not one of them asked how I was doing, if I was lonely, if I needed anything. They ate my food, used my plates, sat in my chairs, and treated me like hired help. When they left that evening, taking containers of leftovers I'd spent hours preparing, I sat in my empty apartment surrounded by dirty dishes and felt more alone than I had in 20 years. That night, I cried until my eyes were raw, but more than sadness, I felt something else growing inside me like a tumor made of anger. Why was I invisible to the people I loved most? Why had my value as a person disappeared the moment they no longer needed my daily sacrifice? Have you ever felt like this? Have you ever given everything to your family, only to be treated like furniture when they're done taking what you have to offer? I started noticing things I'd ignored before. How Sarah only called when she needed something. How Michael's voice changed when I mentioned money. Interested when I might give him some. Irritated when I suggested he pay back what he already owed. How Tommy's rare conversations were filled with polite but distant questions, like he was checking items off a list. How's your health? Good. How's the weather? Fine. Okay, Mom. I have to go. The truth is, I'd been funding their lives for so long that they'd forgotten I was a person instead of a resource. And I'd been so afraid of losing them completely that I'd never set boundaries, never said no, never demanded the basic respect every human being deserves. My breaking point came on a Tuesday in March. I'd been feeling sick for weeks. Not seriously ill, but run down in the way that makes every task feel like climbing a mountain. I finally went to the doctor, and she told me I had pneumonia. Not life-threatening, but serious enough that I needed to rest, take medication, and avoid stress. I called Sarah to let her know. Her response? Oh, well, you can still watch the kids on Saturday, right? We already bought concert tickets. I sat there holding the phone, too stunned to speak. I had pneumonia, and her main concern was whether I could still provide free babysitting. When I explained that the doctor said I needed to rest, she sighed like I was the most inconvenient person on earth. Fine, Mom. I'll figure something else out. But this really messes up our plans. She hung up without asking if I needed anything, without offering to bring me soup or medicine or even a get-well card. I was sick, alone, and apparently still expected to prioritize her convenience over my own health. That's when I started to see the pattern clearly. My value to my children wasn't based on who I was, but on what I could provide. Money when they needed it. Childcare when it was convenient. A place to stay when they wanted to save on hotels. Emotional labor whenever they needed to complain about their lives. But when did they last do something for me just because they loved me? When did they last consider my feelings, my needs, my dreams? When did they last treat me like their mother instead of their unpaid assistant? I spent that week recovering from pneumonia alone in my apartment, and I had plenty of time to think. About Henry, who would be ashamed to see how his children were treating their mother. About the young woman I used to be, full of dreams and energy and hope. About the life I'd put on hold for 40 years, waiting for a moment of appreciation that never came. By the time I was feeling better, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to disappear quietly into old age, forgotten and taken for granted. I wasn't going to keep writing checks I couldn't afford to children who saw me as an ATM with legs. I wasn't going to keep accepting crumbs of affection from people who used to think I hung the moon. I was going to reclaim my life. But change is terrifying when you're 72, and your entire identity has been built around being needed by people who no longer seem to need you, except when they do, and then only for what you can give them. The first thing I did was start keeping track of money. For 2 months, I wrote down every dollar I gave to my children. Cash for Michael's emergency car repairs. Money for Sarah's kids' activities because their budget was tight. Loans that were never repaid, gifts that were expected, contributions to their lives while my own bank account shrank. In 60 days, I'd given them over $3,000. $3,000 from a woman living on Social Security and a small pension, while they all had careers and opportunities I'd sacrificed my own dreams to provide. The numbers staring back at me from that notebook felt like a mathematical proof of my own worthlessness in their eyes. I wasn't their mother anymore. I was their financial strategy. I decided to test my theory. The next time Sarah called asking for money, her daughter needed a new laptop for school, I said no. Not meanly, not with anger, just a simple, quiet no. I explained that my budget was tight, that I was trying to save for potential medical expenses, that I couldn't help this time. The silence on the phone felt like falling into a deep hole. "What do you mean you can't help?" she finally asked, and her voice had changed completely. Gone was any warmth or familiarity. This was the voice she'd use with a stranger who'd disappointed her. "I mean, I can't afford to give you money right now, Sarah. I'm sorry. But it's for your granddaughter's education." The guilt trip was immediate and expertly delivered. Use the grandchild. Make it about education. Make me feel selfish for not sacrificing more. For 40 years, this strategy had worked perfectly. But something was different now. Maybe it was the pneumonia that had shown me how alone I really was. Maybe it was seeing those numbers in my notebook. Maybe I was just tired of being tired. "I understand that," I said, "but I still can't help this time." She hung up on me. For 2 weeks, I didn't hear from any of my children. No calls, no texts, no emails. It was like I'd simply stopped existing the moment I stopped being useful. The message was clear. Love in this family was conditional on my willingness to give them whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted it. But you know what? Those 2 weeks were the most peaceful I'd had in years. I read books I'd been meaning to read for decades. I cooked meals I actually wanted to eat instead of whatever was cheapest. I took long walks around Queens, noticing things I'd been too stressed and exhausted to see before. Flowers in window boxes, children playing in parks, old couples holding hands. I remembered who I used to be before I became the family bank, before I became so afraid of losing their love that I'd forgotten I deserved love that didn't come with conditions. When Sarah finally called again, she was furious. Not hurt, not concerned about our relationship, but angry that her financial plan had been disrupted. She accused me of being selfish, of not caring about my grandchildren, of changing in ways that weren't fair to the family. "You used to be so generous, Mom. What happened to you? What happened to me? I'd spent 60 years giving everything I had to other people, and now that I was trying to keep a tiny piece of my life for myself, I was the problem? I'm still generous," I told her, "but I'm not a bank. I'm your mother. You're acting like a stranger." Maybe I was. Maybe the woman who said yes to everything, who apologized for existing, who measured her worth by how much she could give away, maybe that woman had been a stranger to herself all along. That conversation ended badly too, but this time, I didn't spend days crying and second-guessing myself. I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Like setting down a heavy suitcase I'd been carrying so long, I'd forgotten how much it weighed. Michael was next. He called asking for a loan to help with a down payment on a house. $5,000. Casual as asking for a cup of sugar. When I said I couldn't help, his reaction was even worse than Sarah's. "Come on, Mom. It's not like you're spending money on anything else." Not spending money on anything else. As if my life, my needs, my future security were nothing else. As if I existed only to fund their dreams while having none of my own. "I am spending money on other things, Michael. I'm spending it on my own life." "What life? You just sit in that apartment all day." The cruelty of it took my breath away. What life? The life I'd put on hold for 40 years to raise them. The life I'd sacrificed so they could have better ones. The life I was now, at 72, trying to reclaim from the ashes of their ingratitude. "This conversation is over," I said, and hung up. That night, I called my neighbor Lisa. She's a retired school teacher, 78 years old, with 4 children of her own. We'd been friendly neighbors for years, but never close friends. Something about my family drama had made me ashamed to get too close to anyone. How do you explain that your own children treat you like hired help? But that night, I needed to talk to someone who might understand. Lisa listened to everything. The money, the disrespect, the way they'd turned me into a convenient resource instead of treating me like their mother. When I finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment. Margaret, she finally said, how long do you think you have to live? The question surprised me. I don't know. 10 years? 20, if I'm lucky? And how do you want to spend those years? Waiting for people to appreciate sacrifices they'll never acknowledge? Or living for yourself for the first time in decades? I'd never thought about it that way. How many years did I have left? And what kind of life did I want them to be? Lisa told me about her own experience. How she'd gone through something similar with her children after her husband died. How she'd finally had to set boundaries, demand respect, and stop funding grown adults who should have been funding themselves. It was the hardest thing I ever did, she said, but also the most important. My relationship with my kids is better now because it's based on actual love instead of financial dependency. They see me as a person again, not a piggy bank. That conversation with Lisa changed everything. She became my lifeline during the worst part of this journey, the part I'm about to tell you about. Because when you stop enabling people who've been using you, they don't usually say, "Thank you for helping me become independent." They fight back. They escalate. They try everything they can to get you back under their control. My children declared war. It started with Tommy flying in from California unannounced. He showed up at my door with flowers and that charming smile that used to melt my heart when he was 5 years old. "Mom, we need to talk. Sarah and Michael are worried about you. Worried about me. Not worried about how they'd been treating me, but worried that I'd stopped accepting it." He took me to dinner at a nice restaurant in Manhattan. The first time in years any of my children had spent money on me instead of asking me to spend money on them. For a moment, I let myself hope. Maybe this was the beginning of a real change. Maybe they'd finally seen how much they'd hurt me. But over dessert, Tommy's real agenda became clear. "Mom, you're being unfair to Sarah and Michael. They depend on your help. You can't just cut them off because you're having some kind of midlife crisis." Midlife crisis. At 72. This isn't about a crisis, Tommy. It's about being treated with basic respect. They do respect you. When? When do they respect me? When they hang up on me for saying no? When they only call when they need money? When they treat me like I don't have feelings or needs of my own? Tommy shifted uncomfortably. "They're just stressed, Mom. They have a lot going on. And I don't?" For the first time, he looked genuinely confused. "What do you have going on?" What did I have going on? The question revealed everything. In his mind, and probably in all their minds, my life was empty space waiting to be filled with their needs. I wasn't a person with my own struggles, dreams, fears, or hopes. I was a supporting character in their stories. That dinner ended with Tommy making threats disguised as family concern. If I didn't start behaving normally again, they might need to look into alternatives for my care. Maybe I was developing dementia. Maybe I needed professional help. Maybe I was too old to be making these kinds of decisions. The subtext was clear. Get back in line, or we'll find ways to force you. I went home that night shaking with rage and fear. How had it come to this? How had the people I'd raised and loved and sacrificed everything for become strangers who would threaten me with institutionalization for having boundaries? But I held firm, and they escalated. Sarah started calling me multiple times a day, leaving voicemails that swung between desperate pleading and cold manipulation. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening to you. We're family. Family helps each other. I'm scared you're not thinking clearly." Michael showed up unannounced and tried to get into my apartment building by following other residents through the security door. When that didn't work, he waited outside for 2 hours, calling my phone repeatedly until I finally answered. "Let me up, Mom. We need to talk. We can talk on the phone. This is ridiculous. I'm your son." Then act like my son instead of my creditor. The attacks became more creative. Sarah started involving my grandchildren, having them call and ask why Grandma didn't love them anymore. 8-year-old voices asking questions they'd obviously been coached to ask. "Grandma, did we do something wrong? Mommy says you don't want to help our family anymore." Using children as weapons against their own grandmother. It was lower than I thought they could go, but the worst was yet to come. Tommy orchestrated what he called a family intervention. All 3 of them showed up at my apartment with printed articles about elderly mental health, brochures for assisted living facilities, and a script about how much they loved me and were concerned about my recent behavior. They'd met beforehand and planned their attack. Sarah would cry and talk about how worried she was. Michael would present evidence that I was making poor financial decisions. Tommy would be the voice of reason, suggesting professional evaluation. For 2 hours, they sat in my living room, the same living room where I'd raised them, where I'd helped them with homework and comforted them through heartbreaks and celebrated their achievements, and tried to gaslight me into believing I was mentally incompetent. "Mom, refusing to help family isn't like you," Sarah said through manufactured tears. "We think you might be depressed, or maybe it's early dementia." "I'm not depressed or demented," I said. "I'm setting boundaries." "But these aren't normal boundaries," Michael added. "Normal mothers want to help their children. Normal mothers." As if there was something fundamentally wrong with me for expecting basic respect from the people I'd devoted my life to raising. Tommy delivered the final blow. "Mom, we've been talking to someone about legal guardianship. If you're not capable of making good decisions about your finances anymore, maybe someone else should help you." Legal guardianship. They were threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could control my money directly. The room went silent except for the sound of my heart breaking. These weren't my children anymore. These were strangers wearing my children's faces, willing to destroy me to maintain their access to whatever they could take from my life. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking but my voice steady. "Get out of my apartment." "Mom, we're trying to help you," Sarah protested. "Get out. All of you, right now." They left, but not quietly. There were threats and tears and accusations. Sarah slammed the door. Michael shouted something about how I was making a mistake I'd regret. Tommy just looked at me with cold disappointment, like I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking. That night, alone in my apartment, I did something I hadn't done since Henry died. I screamed. I screamed until my throat was raw and my neighbors probably thought I was being murdered. I screamed out 40 years of suppressed anger, disappointment, and grief. I screamed for the woman I used to be before I lost myself in service to people who didn't appreciate the sacrifice. I screamed for all the dreams I'd deferred and the life I'd never gotten to live. When I was finished screaming, I called Lisa. "They threatened to have me declared incompetent," I told her through tears. "My own children want to take away my independence because I won't give them money anymore." Lisa was quiet for a moment. Then, "Margaret, do you have a lawyer?" I didn't. I'd never needed one before. But Lisa gave me the name of someone she'd used when her own family tried similar tactics years earlier. The next morning, I made an appointment with David Rosen, a lawyer specializing in elder abuse. Yes, elder abuse. That's what this was called when your own family threatens and manipulates you for financial gain. David was a kind man in his 50s who listened to my story without judgment. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Mrs. Sullivan, what your children are doing is unfortunately very common. Adult children who see their aging parents primarily as financial resources often become abusive when those resources are restricted. The threats about guardianship are particularly concerning." He explained my rights, helped me set up a financial power of attorney that would prevent anyone from accessing my accounts without my consent, and gave me documentation proving my mental competency. If my children tried to have me declared unfit, I'd have legal protection. For the first time in months, I felt safe. But the war wasn't over. My children stopped speaking to me entirely. No calls, no texts, no emails. It was like I'd died, except I was still alive and aware of being erased from their lives. Birthdays passed without acknowledgement. Holidays came and went without invitations. The silence was profound and heartbreaking, but it was also revealing. If their love for me could be turned off like a switch the moment I stopped funding their lives, had it ever really been love at all? Or had it just been a transaction disguised as family affection? I started going to a support group for older adults dealing with family estrangement. The stories I heard there were both heartbreaking and validating. I wasn't alone. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't the first mother to discover that unconditional love isn't always reciprocal. There was Helen, whose son had stolen her retirement savings. There was Robert, whose daughter had moved him into a nursing home against his will and sold his house. There was Maria, whose grandchildren had been turned against her because she'd refused to continue funding their mother's shopping addiction. We were a group of parents who'd loved too much, given too freely, and enabled too long. We were learning late in life that love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's codependency. The support group became my lifeline. For the first time in years, I was around people who saw me as a complete person, not just someone's mother or grandmother or wallet. I made friends, real friends, who called to check on me just because they cared, who invited me to movies and dinners with no agenda beyond enjoying each other's company. Slowly, I started to remember who I was beneath all the roles I'd played for other people. I was a woman who loved to read mysteries and cry at romantic movies. I was someone who had opinions about politics and art and whether the Yankees would have a good season. I was a person who deserved to take up space in the world for my own sake, not just for what I could provide to others. I started taking art classes at the community center. My hands, which had spent decades cooking and cleaning and working to support other people, learned to hold brushes and create beauty just because I wanted to. I painted landscapes and portraits and abstract pieces that made no sense to anyone but me. I traveled. Small trips at first, day excursions to nearby towns, weekend visits to places I'd always wanted to see. I rode trains and buses and looked out windows at scenery I'd been too stressed and exhausted to notice before. I ate meals in restaurants without worrying about the cost, stayed in hotels just because I wanted to sleep in a bed someone else would make. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself, but my children weren't done with me yet. 6 months after our last contact, Sarah launched a new campaign. She couldn't manipulate me directly anymore, so she went public. She posted on social media about her mentally ill mother, who had abandoned her family. She shared carefully edited stories about how I'd cut off my grandchildren, leaving out any mention of the years of financial exploitation that had led to my decision to set boundaries. The post was designed to make me look like a villain, a crazy old woman who'd turned her back on loving children for no reason. It got hundreds of sympathetic comments from people who didn't know the real story, all telling Sarah how sorry they were that she was dealing with such a difficult mother. My phone started ringing. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years suddenly wanted to check on me and offer unsolicited advice about family reconciliation. Church members approached me with concerned expressions and gentle suggestions that I might want to consider family counseling. The public shaming was devastating. Sarah had turned my private struggle into a public spectacle, casting herself as the victim and me as the mentally unstable villain. She'd weaponized social media against her own mother. When I saw that post, my first instinct was to defend myself, to comment with the truth, to share my side of the story, to explain about the years of financial abuse and emotional manipulation. But then I remembered what David, my lawyer, had told me. The best response to manipulation is often no response at all. I didn't comment on Sarah's post. I didn't call her friends to explain my side. I didn't engage with the drama she'd created. Instead, I sat quietly in my apartment, drinking tea and watching the sunset through my window. I felt the hurt, deep, profound hurt that my own daughter would try to destroy my reputation to force me back into compliance. But I also felt something else. Peace. Because I knew the truth. I knew that I'd spent 40 years sacrificing everything for ungrateful children who'd used me until there was almost nothing left. I knew that setting boundaries wasn't mental illness. It was mental health. I knew that choosing self-respect over family dysfunction was the sanest thing I'd ever done. The people who mattered, Lisa, my support group friends, the lawyer who'd protected my rights, they all knew the real story. The opinions of strangers on social media, manipulated by carefully crafted lies, simply didn't matter. 3 months passed. The social media drama faded as these things always do, replaced by newer scandals and fresher outrage. My life settled into a rhythm I'd never experienced before. Peaceful, self-directed, mine. I woke up when I wanted to wake up. I ate what I wanted to eat. I spent my money on things that brought me joy instead of funding other people's lifestyles. I read books and took walks and had long conversations with friends who valued my thoughts and opinions. I was happy, genuinely happy, for the first time in decades. But the universe apparently wasn't finished testing me yet. That brings me back to the diner on Northern Boulevard, where this story began. It was a Tuesday evening in November. I'd been having dinner alone, as I often did now, not because I was lonely, but because I'd learned to enjoy my own company. The meatloaf reminded me of Sunday dinners from long ago, but instead of making me sad, the memory felt warm and distant, like looking at old photographs. I was thinking about my plans for the next day, an art class in the morning, maybe a movie with Lisa in the afternoon, when the waitress slipped that note under my plate. "Leave now. Don't ask questions." I should have been scared, but mostly I was confused. The woman looked familiar. Silver hair, kind eyes, roughly my age. Had I seen her somewhere before? I trusted her instinct and left through the back exit just as she'd silently urged. 10 minutes later, the chaos erupted. 3 men, shouting about money, overturning tables, terrifying everyone inside. As I watched the police arrive and people flee the diner, I realized something profound. For the first time in my adult life, I'd been saved by a stranger who'd acted purely out of human kindness. Not because she owed me anything, not because she wanted something from me, but simply because she'd seen danger and wanted to protect another human being. It was the kind of care my own children had stopped showing me years ago. The next morning, I returned to the diner. The windows were boarded up, but there was a small sign with information about the staff. I learned that the waitress was named Dorothy Chen, and she'd worked there for 15 years. The incident had been a robbery gone wrong. One of the men had been looking for a former employee who owed money to dangerous people. I never got to thank Dorothy properly. The diner closed permanently after the robbery, and I never saw her again. But her act of kindness, warning a stranger to flee from danger, stayed with me. It reminded me that real love, real care, real family isn't always about blood relations. Sometimes it's about human beings looking out for each other with no agenda beyond basic human decency. 2 weeks later, my grandson called me. Sarah's oldest child, now 15, had somehow gotten my phone number. His voice was different than I remembered, deeper, more mature, and he was crying. "Grandma? It's Alex. I'm sorry to bother you, but something's happening at home, and I didn't know who else to call." My heart clenched. Whatever had happened between me and his mother, this was still my grandchild. "What's wrong, honey?" Through tears, he told me that his parents were getting divorced, that there had been screaming fights about money and debt, that his mother had been struggling financially ever since I'd stopped helping, but had been too proud to admit it, that she'd been saying terrible things about me to cover up her own financial mismanagement. I heard Mom on the phone with Aunt somebody, talking about how she made up some of the stuff she posted about you on Facebook. She said she had to make you look bad so people wouldn't ask questions about why you really stopped giving her money. The confession hit me like a physical blow. She'd deliberately lied about me on social media, destroying my reputation to hide her own financial irresponsibility. She'd turned family and friends against me with fabricated stories about my mental health and abandonment of the family. But Alex wasn't finished. "Grandma, I know what really happened. I'm old enough to understand now. I remember all the times Mom would get money from you and then complain to Dad that it wasn't enough. I remember her talking about how you were good for it whenever they needed extra cash. I remember how she never wanted to visit you except when she needed something." He paused, struggling with words that must have felt like betrayal of his own mother. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm sorry we all let her treat you that way. I'm sorry I didn't call you until now. I was scared Mom would be mad, but I miss you. I miss my real grandma, not the crazy person Mom talks about on Facebook." I cried then. Not the angry, frustrated tears I'd shed so many times over the past year, but tears of relief and love and profound sadness for all the time we'd lost. "I miss you too, Alex. I love you so much. Can I see you sometime? Without telling Mom? At least until things calm down?" That's when I knew, despite everything, that some relationships can survive manipulation and lies. Alex was old enough to see through his mother's narrative and brave enough to reach out despite the risks. He was choosing our relationship over family politics. We met the following Saturday at a park in Queens. He'd taken 2 buses to get there, determined to see his grandmother despite his mother's campaign against me. We sat on a bench and talked for 3 hours. Really talked. Maybe for the first time in his life. I learned that he was struggling in school, not because he wasn't smart, but because of the chaos at home. I learned that he'd been working part-time jobs to help with family expenses, sacrificing his own teenage experiences to fill the financial gap my absence had created. I learned that he'd been defending me in family conversations, which had made him a target of his mother's anger. "Mom says you changed," he told me, "but I think you just remembered who you were." Out of the mouths of teenagers, we started meeting regularly. I helped him with college applications, listened to his fears about his parents' divorce, encouraged his dreams of studying music. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like someone's grandmother again. Not their ATM, not their obligatory duty, but their beloved elder who had wisdom and love to share. Alex became the bridge between my old life and my new one. Through him, I learned that Michael was struggling too, that his business ventures had failed partly because he'd relied on my money instead of developing sustainable business skills. I learned that Tommy was having marital problems, that his perfect California life wasn't so perfect after all. But most importantly, I learned that my decision to set boundaries hadn't destroyed my family. It had revealed who my family really was. The people who truly loved me found ways to maintain our relationship despite the obstacles. The people who only valued me for what I could provide simply disappeared when the well ran dry. 6 months later, something unexpected happened. Michael called me, not asking for money, not demanding anything, just calling to talk. His voice was different, humbler, sadder, but also more real than I'd heard it in years. "Mom, I owe you an apology, a big one." I held my breath, afraid to hope, but unable to hang up. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since Dad and I stopped talking, about how I treated you, about the money I took and never paid back, about the things I said during that intervention. I was wrong, Mom. I was so wrong." His voice cracked, and I realized he was crying. "I justified it because I told myself you wanted to help us. But the truth is, I got used to using you. I stopped seeing you as my mother and started seeing you as, I don't know, as a resource. Someone who would always be there to fix my mistakes and fund my dreams." The honesty was shocking and painful and healing all at once. "When you stopped giving me money, I was angry. I thought you were being selfish. But now I realize you were trying to save our relationship. You were trying to make me grow up." We talked for 2 hours. He told me about his failed businesses, his debt, his realization that he'd never learned to be financially responsible because I'd always been there to bail him out. He told me about his divorce, his struggles with depression, his slow understanding that the way our family had treated me was abusive. "I want to earn your forgiveness," he said. "Not buy it, not manipulate it, but earn it. I want to be your son again, not your dependent." It was the conversation I'd dreamed of having for years, but it came too late to fix everything that had been broken. Some damages are permanent. Some trust, once destroyed, can never be fully rebuilt. But it was a beginning. Michael started coming by for visits with no agenda. He brought groceries sometimes, not because I needed him to, but because he wanted to contribute something positive to my life. He helped me with small repairs around the apartment, listened to stories about my art classes, asked about my friends. Slowly, carefully, we began rebuilding a relationship based on mutual respect instead of financial dependency. Sarah, however, doubled down on her victimhood narrative. When she discovered that Alex was seeing me secretly and that Michael was trying to reconcile, she escalated her public campaign against me. More social media posts, more lies, more attempts to turn extended family and old friends against me. But something had changed in how I responded to her attacks. They still hurt. How could they not? This was my daughter, my firstborn, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep and protected from nightmares. But they no longer had the power to destroy me. I'd found my own worth outside of her approval. I'd built a life that didn't depend on her validation. I'd learned that someone else's mental illness or personality disorder or simple cruelty didn't have to become my emergency. Sarah was fighting to maintain a version of our family dynamic where she could treat me however she wanted while still having access to whatever she needed from me. But that dynamic was dead, killed by my refusal to participate in it anymore. She could lie about me on social media, turn relatives against me, try to weaponize my other grandchildren. None of it could force me back into the role of her personal bank account and emotional punching bag. I was free of her manipulation because I'd stopped caring whether she approved of my choices. Tommy remained radio silent for over a year. Then, out of nowhere, he showed up at my apartment on a rainy Thursday morning. He looked terrible, thin, exhausted, older than his 43 years. His California life had fallen apart. Divorce, job loss, financial ruin. The golden child had discovered that the world didn't actually revolve around him. "I need help, Mom," he said, and I could see him trying to calculate exactly how desperate he'd have to appear to get what he needed from me. "What kind of help?" I asked calmly. "Financial help. I'm broke. I lost everything, and I need a place to stay while I get back on my feet." The old me would have said yes immediately, would have emptied my savings, cleared out my spare room, devoted myself to fixing his life while putting mine on hold again. But I wasn't the old me anymore. "I'm sorry to hear about your troubles, Tommy. That sounds really difficult." He waited for the offer of money, of housing, of salvation. When it didn't come, his facade began to crack. "Well, are you going to help me or not?" "I'm not going to give you money or let you move in here, if that's what you're asking." His face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, disbelief, and finally, rage. "What the hell is wrong with you? I'm your son. I'm broke and homeless, and you won't help me? You're 43 years old. You're not actually homeless. You're staying with friends, trying to figure out your next move. And you didn't come here because you missed me or wanted to rebuild our relationship. You came here because you need money. So what if I did? You're my mother. Helping your children is supposed to be automatic." There it was, the assumption that had poisoned our relationship for decades. That being someone's mother meant sacrificing everything, accepting any treatment, providing unlimited resources with no expectation of respect or reciprocation. "I helped you for 40 years, Tommy. I paid for your education, supported your dreams, bailed you out of problems you created for yourself. And the only times you called me were when you needed something. The only time you visit is when you're desperate. Because that's what mothers do." "No," I said quietly. "That's what doormats do. Mothers love their children, but they also teach them to be independent, responsible adults. I failed you by enabling you for so long." He stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "I can't give you money, and I won't let you move in here. But if you want to work on having a real relationship, one based on mutual respect instead of financial dependency, I'm open to that." Tommy chose the money. He left that day cursing me, calling me selfish and crazy and a terrible mother. He told me I'd regret not helping him when I was old and needed care. He threatened to make sure my other grandchildren never spoke to me again, but his threats felt empty because I'd already survived the worst they could do. I'd already lost them and found myself. I'd already discovered that being alone with dignity was better than being used without respect. As I watched him walk away from my building, I felt sad, but not guilty. Sad for the relationship we'd never had. Sad for the man he'd become. Sad for the little boy I'd once loved who'd grown up without learning how to love others in return. But not guilty. Not anymore. How do you know when you've truly healed from family dysfunction? When their attempts to manipulate you feel more like theater than genuine threat. When their approval stops being necessary for your peace. When their absence from your life feels like relief instead of loss. I reached that point gradually, over the course of 2 years. It started with small victories, saying no to unreasonable requests, spending money on myself without guilt, making plans that prioritized my own happiness. Then bigger ones, setting firm boundaries, refusing to be drawn into drama, building relationships based on mutual respect. But the real breakthrough came when I stopped waiting for them to change. For years, I'd held on to hope that my children would suddenly see how much they'd hurt me and transform into the loving, appreciative family I'd always wanted. I'd imagined tearful apologies, grateful acknowledgments of my sacrifices, renewed relationships built on mutual care. But people don't usually change unless they want to, and they rarely want to change a dynamic that benefits them. Sarah was never going to admit that she'd used me financially and emotionally abused me when I tried to set boundaries. That would require acknowledging that she wasn't the victim in our relationship. She was the perpetrator. Tommy was never going to appreciate the decades of sacrifice I'd made for his benefit. That would require gratitude and humility he'd never developed. Only Michael seemed capable of genuine change, and even his transformation was slow, imperfect, sometimes frustrating. But here's what I learned. I didn't need them to change for me to be happy. I didn't need their validation to know my worth. I didn't need their approval to live a fulfilling life. I needed to change. I needed to stop defining myself by their needs and start building a life based on my own values, dreams, and desires. So that's what I did. I joined a book club at the local library and discovered that I had strong opinions about literature that other people found interesting. I volunteered at a food pantry and found meaning in helping people who genuinely needed assistance. I took Spanish classes and learned that my 74-year-old brain was still capable of growing in new directions. I dated. Yes, at my age I started dating. Nothing serious, just companionship with men who enjoyed my company and didn't see me as a source of free labor or financial support. Coffee dates, walks in Prospect Park, trips to museums and art galleries. I remembered what it felt like to dress up for someone who appreciated me, to have conversations with no agenda beyond mutual enjoyment. I traveled more extensively. I took a train across the country, staying in small towns and big cities, meeting strangers who became temporary friends, seeing landscapes that reminded me how big and beautiful the world was beyond my small apartment and former small life. I spent money on myself without guilt. Nice clothes, good food, theater tickets, art supplies. For decades, I'd lived like a monk, saving every penny for other people's emergencies. Now I was investing in my own happiness, and the returns were tremendous. I bought a small car, the first one I'd owned since Henry died. Learning to drive again at my age was terrifying and exhilarating. The freedom of being able to go wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted, without depending on buses or taxis or other people's schedules, felt revolutionary. Most importantly, I stopped apologizing for existing. For years, I'd moved through the world like I was taking up space I hadn't earned. I'd apologized for having needs, for expressing opinions, for asking for basic respect. I'd made myself as small and undemanding as possible, hoping that would make people love me more. But making yourself small doesn't inspire love. It inspires contempt. People don't respect what they don't value, and they don't value what comes too easily. My new life was built on a radical concept. I deserved to be happy simply because I was human. I deserved respect, kindness, and consideration, not because of what I could provide to others, but because of my inherent worth as a person. This revelation came slowly, supported by therapy, good friends, new experiences, and the gradual understanding that love isn't supposed to hurt all the time. Real love involves mutual respect, shared joy, reciprocal care, and healthy boundaries. Real love doesn't require you to sacrifice your identity, exhaust your resources, or accept abuse in exchange for affection. I'd spent so many years in relationships that violated all of these principles that I'd forgotten what healthy love felt like. Now I was surrounded by it. Lisa, who called me just to chat and always asked how I was doing before launching into her own news. The book club members who valued my insights and missed me when I couldn't attend meetings. The volunteers at the food pantry who appreciated my contributions and treated me like a valued team member. Alex, who'd grown into a thoughtful young man and regularly sought my advice, not because he had to, but because he genuinely respected my perspective. Michael, who was slowly rebuilding trust through consistent actions rather than dramatic promises. And myself. I'd learned to be good company for myself, to enjoy my own thoughts and interests, to treat myself with the same kindness I'd always shown others. This is what healing looks like. Not the absence of sadness about what was lost, but the presence of joy about what was found. I still felt sad sometimes about the family relationships that had been destroyed or damaged. I still grieved for the mother-daughter relationship Sarah and I would never have. I still wished Tommy could see how his choices had hurt both of us. But those feelings no longer dominated my emotional landscape. They were weather passing through, not permanent storms. My life was fuller and richer at 75 than it had ever been. I had genuine friendships, meaningful activities, financial security, because I was no longer funding other people's poor decisions, and most importantly, self-respect. I'd discovered that the opposite of being used isn't being alone, it's being valued. Let me tell you about what a typical day looks like for me now, compared to how I used to live. I wake up naturally, usually around 7 a.m., without an alarm clock screaming demands at me. The first thing I do is make coffee the way I like it, strong and black, in my favorite ceramic mug that Sarah once criticized as too fancy for everyday use. I sit by my window and watch queens wake up around me. Children walking to school, people heading to work, joggers starting their morning runs. The city feels alive and full of possibility instead of overwhelming and isolating. I read the news, but I turn it off when it becomes too depressing. I've learned that staying informed is important, but drowning in negativity is optional. Some days I go to my art class, where I'm working on a series of paintings about urban landscapes. My teacher, a woman half my age, treats me like a serious artist whose work has value. She pushes me to experiment with new techniques, celebrates my progress, includes me in gallery shows. Other days I volunteer at the food pantry, where I help distribute groceries to families experiencing economic hardship. The irony isn't lost on me. I'm helping people who actually need assistance, while for years I was funding people who simply wanted assistance. The families at the food pantry are grateful, respectful, and honest about their circumstances. They don't manipulate or guilt trip or make demands. They appreciate what's offered and work hard to improve their situations. It's a completely different dynamic than I experienced with my own children. I have lunch with friends regularly, real friends who pay their own way and don't expect me to subsidize their social lives. We talk about books, politics, travel, grandchildren, health concerns, dreams we still want to pursue. These conversations nourish me in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Afternoons might include errands, but they're errands for my own life, not endless chores for ungrateful family members. Grocery shopping for foods I actually want to eat. Banking that's about managing my own finances instead of funding other people's emergencies. Doctor's appointments where the focus is on my health and well-being. Evenings are mine. I might read, watch movies I choose, work on art projects, call Alex or Michael if I feel like it. I go to bed when I'm tired, not when I've finally finished everything everyone else needed from me. The silence in my apartment is peaceful now instead of oppressive. It's the silence of contentment rather than abandonment. Do I get lonely? Sometimes. But loneliness is different from isolation, and isolation is different from solitude. I'd been isolated for years while surrounded by family, present in their lives but not seen, needed but not valued, used but not loved. Now I choose solitude when it serves me and seek company when I want it. The difference is agency. I'm no longer at the mercy of other people's decisions about whether I'm worth their time and attention. But this story isn't over yet. 3 months ago, something happened that tested every lesson I'd learned about boundaries, self-worth, and the nature of healthy relationships. Sarah's marriage fell apart completely. Her husband left her for a younger woman, taking half their assets and leaving her with debt, 2 teenage children, and no reliable income. Her social media presence, which had been so focused on making me look like a terrible mother, abruptly shifted to photos of her looking overwhelmed and posts about the unfairness of divorce and the struggles of single motherhood. She was facing the same challenges I'd faced 40 years earlier when Henry died, but without the family support system she'd systematically destroyed through her own choices. And then she called me. Not Alex calling on her behalf, not a manipulation through social media, but Sarah herself, calling my number for the first time in over 2 years. I almost didn't answer. When I saw her name on my phone, my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. What could she possibly want that wouldn't involve some attempt to guilt me back into funding her life? But curiosity won out. "Hello, Sarah." "Mom." Her voice was different, smaller, less certain than I remembered. "I know I don't have the right to call you. I know I burned bridges. But I need to tell you something." I waited. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mom. For everything. For the money. For the posts on Facebook. For the things I said about you. For the intervention. For all of it. I was wrong. I was so wrong." The words I'd waited years to hear, but they came too late to heal all the damage that had been done. "I'm listening." I said carefully. Through tears, she told me about her divorce, her financial struggles, her realization that she'd destroyed relationships with everyone who'd ever genuinely cared about her. She talked about going to therapy, about learning to recognize her own manipulative patterns, about understanding how she'd abused the people who loved her most. I see it now, Mom. How I treated you, how I used you, how I turned you into the villain when you were just trying to protect yourself. I destroyed our relationship because I couldn't admit that I was the problem. She cried. I cried. For 20 minutes, we grieved together for the relationship that could have been, the years that were lost, the damage that might never fully heal. I don't expect forgiveness, she said finally. I don't expect you to help me now, after everything I did. I needed you to know that I understand what happened. And I'm sorry. Here's the thing about genuine apologies versus manipulative ones. Genuine apologies don't come with conditions or expectations. They don't include subtle requests for specific responses. They don't try to minimize the harm done or shift blame to external circumstances. Sarah's apology felt real. She wasn't asking for money or help. She wasn't making excuses about stress or mental health or difficult circumstances. She was taking full responsibility for her choices and their consequences. But an apology, even a genuine one, doesn't automatically rebuild trust or restore relationships. It's a beginning, not an ending. I appreciate you calling, I told her. And I'm sorry you're going through such a difficult time. But I need to think about all of this. I understand. I don't have any right to expect anything from you. We hung up, and I sat in my quiet apartment processing emotions I hadn't felt in years. Relief that she'd finally acknowledged the truth. Sadness for all the time we'd lost. Wariness about whether this was genuine change or another manipulation strategy. But also something unexpected. Pity. Sarah was 48 years old, and just now learning lessons about respect, boundaries, and healthy relationships that most people figure out much earlier in life. She'd spent decades burning bridges, alienating people who cared about her, and building her identity around victimhood and entitlement. Now she was facing the consequences of those choices, and the life she'd built on manipulation and financial dependency had collapsed around her. I felt sorry for her, but I didn't feel responsible for fixing her situation. Over the following weeks, Sarah called occasionally, not asking for anything, just trying to rebuild some kind of connection. She told me about her therapy sessions, her job search, her struggles to help her children adjust to their new circumstances. She asked about my life, my art, my friends, my activities, in ways that felt genuinely interested rather than obligatory. Slowly, carefully, we began talking like two adults who shared a complicated history rather than like a parent and child locked in toxic dynamics. Then came the test. Sarah's youngest child, my granddaughter Emma, needed medical treatment that insurance wouldn't fully cover. The bill was substantial. Several $1,000s that Sarah simply didn't have. In the old days, this would have been an automatic bailout from Grandma's savings account. Sarah called me about the situation, and I could hear her struggling with how to present it. I want to be clear that I'm not asking you for money, she said. I know I don't have the right to ask for that anymore. But I thought you should know about Emma's situation, in case you wanted to help in some way. But I understand if you don't. It was masterfully done, I'll give her that. The request was implicit rather than explicit, framed as information sharing rather than manipulation. She was giving me room to say no while still making sure I knew about the opportunity to say yes. This was my moment of truth. Had I really changed? Or would I revert to old patterns when faced with a grandchild's genuine need? I told Sarah I'd think about it and call her back. That evening, I sat with the decision. Emma was innocent in all of this. A 15-year-old girl who needed medical care. The grandmother I used to be would have written a check immediately, regardless of her mother's past behavior. But I'd learned that helping isn't always helpful. That rescuing people from the consequences of their choices often prevents them from learning to make better choices. That financial assistance without boundaries often enables rather than supports. I called Sarah back the next day. I'll pay for Emma's medical bills directly, I said. I'll contact the medical center and arrange payment. But I want to be clear about my boundaries. Of course. Whatever you think is appropriate. This is a gift for Emma, not for you. It's not the beginning of me resuming financial support for your family. It's a one-time decision based on a child's medical needs. I understand completely. And I want Emma to know where the money came from. Not as a way to make you look bad, but so she understands that her grandmother cares about her well-being. There was a pause. In the old days, Sarah would have wanted credit for any financial assistance, would have presented herself as the provider, even when the money came from me. That's fair, she said quietly. She should know you're helping her. I paid Emma's medical bills, and she wrote me a thank you note, the first direct contact I'd had with that grandchild in over 2 years. It was a simple card, but her words showed maturity and genuine gratitude. Thank you for helping with my surgery, Grandma. Mom explained about everything that happened between you two, and she said it was her fault that we haven't seen you. I hope maybe we can spend time together again someday. I miss you. That card meant more to me than any amount of money I'd ever given away. But the real victory was internal. I'd helped someone I loved without sacrificing my boundaries, without returning to old patterns, without opening myself up to renewed manipulation. I could be generous when I chose to be generous, rather than when I felt obligated or guilty or manipulated. And Sarah seemed to understand the difference. Over the past months, we've continued to rebuild our relationship slowly. She's gotten a job, moved to a smaller apartment, learned to manage money without expecting bailouts from relatives. Her children are adjusting to their new circumstances with the resilience kids often show when adults stop shielding them from reality. We're not close the way we were when she was a child, and we may never be. Too much damage was done, too many years were lost, too much trust was broken. But we're finding a new way to be mother and daughter, one based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. She's learning to see me as a person with my own life, needs, and boundaries. I'm learning to love her without sacrificing myself for her benefit. It's not the relationship I dreamed of when she was born, but it's honest in ways our old dynamic never was. Michael continues to visit regularly, and our relationship grows stronger each month. He's found stable employment, paid off most of his debts, and learned to manage money responsibly. More importantly, he's learned to be a son rather than a dependent. Alex graduated high school and was accepted to college with scholarships and financial aid. He didn't need a wealthy grandmother to fund his education because he'd learned to work hard and plan ahead. Our relationship remains strong because it's based on genuine affection rather than financial transactions. Tommy remains out of contact, apparently still waiting for me to return to my former role as family ATM. I'm sad about that, but I'm no longer willing to sacrifice my well-being to maintain relationships with people who refuse to treat me with basic respect. The hardest part of this whole journey hasn't been losing family relationships that were built on unhealthy dynamics. It's been forgiving myself for enabling those dynamics for so long. Why did I allow my children to use me as their personal bank for decades? Why did I accept emotional abuse in exchange for fleeting moments of affection? Why did I sacrifice my own dreams and security to fund their poor decisions? The answers are complicated, rooted in my own childhood, my fears of abandonment, my misunderstanding of what love actually looks like. I'd been taught that mothers should be selfless, that family always comes first, that unconditional love means accepting any treatment in exchange for being needed. But those lessons were wrong. Love isn't supposed to be one-sided. Families should support each other, not exploit each other. Unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional tolerance of abuse. I spent years in therapy working through these revelations, learning to separate healthy giving from codependent enabling, understanding the difference between love and fear-based attachment. The work was painful but necessary. You can't build a healthy life on an unhealthy foundation. Now, at 76, I'm living proof that it's never too late to reclaim your life from people who've been using you. It's never too late to set boundaries, develop self-respect, and choose relationships based on mutual care rather than one-sided sacrifice. Some people won't like the new version of you. They'll complain that you've changed and demand that you return to patterns that served their interests at your expense. Let them complain. Their dissatisfaction with your boundaries is proof that the boundaries are necessary. The people who truly love you will adapt to your growth and respect your evolution. The people who only valued you for what you could provide will disappear. and their absence will be a gift, even if it doesn't feel that way at first. I think about that waitress in the diner sometimes, the one who slipped me that warning note. She saw danger and acted quickly to protect a stranger, no questions asked. Her kindness came with no conditions, no expectations, no agenda beyond basic human care. That's what real love looks like. Not the guilt trips and manipulations and emotional blackmail I'd mistaken for family affection, but simple, direct care for another person's well-being. I've tried to model that kind of love in my own relationships now. I help when I can and want to help, not when I'm pressured or manipulated into helping. I give what I can afford to lose, not what I need for my own security. I offer support without trying to control outcomes or expecting gratitude that lasts longer than the assistance provided. It's a completely different way of relating to people, and it's attracted completely different kinds of relationships into my life. My friend Lisa passed away last year at 82, surrounded by family who adored her and friends who treasured her memory. Her funeral was standing room only, a celebration of a life well lived, relationships well tended, boundaries well maintained. I want my own legacy to be similar. Not the woman who gave everything away until there was nothing left, but the woman who learned to give wisely, love healthily, and value herself appropriately. When I die, hopefully many years from now, I want people to remember me as someone who was genuinely kind but not easily manipulated, someone who was generous but not foolish, someone who loved deeply but didn't sacrifice herself on the altar of other people's dysfunction. I want my grandchildren to remember a grandmother who taught them about self-respect and healthy relationships by example, who showed them that love doesn't require you to diminish yourself for other people's comfort. I want to leave behind enough money to be helpful, but not so much that it corrupts anyone's character or creates generations of entitled dependence. Mostly, I want to be remembered as someone who figured out, even late in life, how to live authentically, rather than just existing as other people's convenience. These days, I wake up grateful. Grateful for hard-won wisdom, for genuine friendships, for the opportunity to rebuild my life at an age when many people think change is impossible. I'm grateful for the art classes that taught me I could still learn new skills, for the book club discussions that showed me my opinions mattered, for the volunteer work that reminded me I had value beyond what I could provide to family members. I'm grateful for Alex, who chose love over family politics, and for Michael, who chose growth over entitlement. I'm even grateful for Sarah's recent attempts to rebuild our relationship with honesty instead of manipulation. I'm grateful for my small but authentic life, for relationships based on mutual respect, for the peace that comes from living according to your own values rather than other people's expectations. Most importantly, I'm grateful that I learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, between being needed and being valued, between being used and being loved. The woman who sat in that diner 2 years ago was invisible, exhausted, and convinced that her only value lay in what she could give away. She was waiting for scraps of attention from people who saw her as a wallet with legs. The woman telling you this story now is visible, energetic, and confident in her own worth. She's surrounded by people who see her as a complete human being, not just someone's mother or grandmother or source of emergency funding. That transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy. It required courage I didn't know I had, boundaries I'd never learned to set, and a willingness to risk losing everything to gain something more valuable, myself. But it was worth every difficult conversation, every moment of self-doubt, every relationship that didn't survive the transition from dysfunction to health. Because the life I'm living now, this small, authentic, respectful, peaceful life, is the life I should have been living all along. If any of this sounds familiar to you, if you recognize yourself in the woman I used to be, please know that change is possible at any age. It's never too late to stop being invisible and start being seen. It's never too late to demand the respect you've always deserved. It won't be easy, and not everyone will support your transformation. But the people who truly love you will celebrate your growth, and the people who don't, well, their opposition will tell you everything you need to know about the nature of your relationship with them. You deserve to be happy. You deserve to be respected. You deserve to be valued for who you are, not just what you can provide. You deserve to be visible. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where you felt invisible, useful only for what you could give? Have you ever had to choose between being used and being alone? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this message resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue sharing stories that might help someone else find the courage to reclaim their own visibility, their own worth, their own life. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop disappearing for other people's comfort and start showing up for your own joy.